Hello, my name is Gary Gomes. I'm here to talk to you about a variety of forms of astrology. I'm here to give you some recommendations over the next few weeks. I'm actually coming to you during, I'm actually doing this recording during not quite during a lunar eclipse, but close to a lunar eclipse. Lunar eclipse will appear tonight around or late afternoon, roughly between 4 and 8 tonight. Now, lunar eclipses, we've already spoken about these in previous broadcasts, but I just want to take a little bit of a chance to discuss lunar eclipses. And essentially, lunar eclipses are caused by whenever the Earth passes between the sun and the moon. It's a relatively common phenomenon. In really striking lunar eclipses, the moon looks a little bit red. It looks a little bit, it looks really striking. It's actually quite beautiful. Most Indian astrologers don't recommend you go out during lunar eclipses or you do anything during lunar eclipses. It's a good time to meditate. It's a good time to write down plans. It's a good time to, if you're so inclined, to write wishes down or to plan ideas or to meditate. You know, for those of you who know how to meditate, actually it's an easy process. I teach meditation, but so do many people. And you can do meditation electronically through guided meditation tapes. You can do meditation through a teacher. But anytime that you can go inside and reflect on what you truly want as opposed to the externals, because the entity in Indian thought, the entity that causes eclipses, especially lunar eclipses, has the ability to cloud our minds. It can make us very confused. It can make us want all sorts of material things at the cost of happiness. And I'm not saying the material things don't bring happiness. They certainly can, but the entire idea is, at least of existence in this life, is to be happy with what you are, with what you have, and the less you crave after things, the more content you'll be. It doesn't mean you shouldn't strive to better yourself. It doesn't mean you shouldn't strive to do things and to leave legacies and to help your children and to do all these other things or to advance in your job. But it's the idea of craving, of desire, of ambition without point, of accumulating more and more stuff. So we're all prone to these habits. This is not necessarily a condemnation of people who want those things, but you'll find if you get, let's say, one thing, then you'll want another thing, then you'll want another thing. And the expression I heard many, many years ago is desires have no end. So as you start desiring things, you'll want more and more and more and more, and that can get a little bit habitual. So one of the things that lunar eclipses can do is it can make you, number one, overly ambitious. You can overpromise things to people. It can cloud your judgments. You may start desiring things that aren't necessarily good for you. It can cause habitual behaviors if it's in a birth chart, those types of things. So again, they're not bad things. As a matter of fact, the eclipse points are often considered paths to spiritual life because the person looks and says, I have all this stuff, I'm still not happy. What will bring me happiness? Well, maybe if I find inner peace, that will make me happy. So it can be a pathway to inner peace. But it's also a little bit illusional, and that we have all this stuff out here. We have all these great gifts and great things, and they're marvelous things. You know, the world is a really creative place. You know, the world wouldn't be at its current stage of technological evolution if it weren't for the eclipses, or at least from my understanding. But again, it's everything in life has a temper, has a balance to it. So lunar eclipses tend to kind of distort that balance. Right now, the lunar eclipse tonight, and this will be broadcast a few days down the road, is in Gemini. It's been a very disruptive eclipse for certain individuals that I've known. I've known a lot of people who've had relationship problems and work-related problems because of these two eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius. And you'll also see a certain element of obstruction, but there's also a third factor working on this particular eclipse, and that is there's a direct aspect of Saturn, and Saturn tends to limit or obstruct things. So that Saturn will move out of Sagittarius at least in the Hindu system, around January 30th, February 1st of next year. So a lot of obstructions that people who were born between roughly June 15th and July 15th, or who were born between, or who have their moons or their rising signs in that particular sign, will see a lot of the obstructions go. They'll still have a lot of desires, they'll still have a lot of ambition, but the obstructions to those ambitions or desires will tend to go quite a bit. That will tend to pass. The other thing about this eclipse, though, is usually they say to look for difficult phenomena. I usually like to look 2 weeks before an eclipse and 2 weeks after an eclipse. I think some astrologers tend to put like months onto the end of an eclipse, and I think that's excessive. I mean, for sensitive planets, if a planet is at the same degree as an eclipse, and we're just getting into a very technical aspect of astrology right now, then something will happen connected with those planets. So let's say if Venus is in your natal chart is at the same degree as the eclipse, then something significant is going to happen with your relationship life. If Saturn's at the same degree as the eclipse, then something's going to happen with your work life. Same with Mercury. And so those types of things are specific to individual charts, but not to the entire world. The other thing to keep in mind is, in addition to the eclipses we've had between July 2nd, and July 16th, 17th, which is when this eclipse is going to happen, we've had two major planets within Vedic astrology and two major planets outside of Vedic astrology, all retrograde. And the three planets within the Vedic astrology tradition, at least the tradition that I follow, are Jupiter, Saturn, and Mercury. Now, Mercury goes retrograde fairly frequently. It's not really an uncommon phenomenon and usually the worst thing that happens during Mercury retrogrades is that you'll see a lot of miscommunication. You'll see some electronic difficulties. We've seen a lot of blackouts over the past couple of months, and that's also caused by Saturn and Jupiter retrogrades, and some would say, and a person who follows Uranus and Pluto would also say those planets being retrograde play a part in that as well. But also you've seen the earthquakes in California. You've seen a threat of a tsunami off the coast of Australia, roughly by the Philippines, I believe it was. And those things were things I actually predicted earlier on in earlier broadcasts. So, and also right now there are some problems in Russia, from what I recall, in terms of essentially along the eclipse line. And I can't remember exactly what they were, but they were land related. And we had that freakish hailstorm in Mexico a few weeks ago. So those are all K2. You can use K2 to the South Lunar Node to explain those. You don't necessarily need Pluto, but some people feel more satisfied if they include Pluto in the mix or Uranus in the mix, and that's fine. But the major thing to watch out for the eclipses, for the primary eclipses, especially from Saturn, Jupiter, and Mercury, is that essentially Jupiter is aspecting Mercury, so that's helpful to a certain extent, but it also tends to expand things. And what do I mean by that? Well, basically, Jupiter's a planet which tends to blow things up or conflate them. So in most Vedic astrologers consider it to be a benefic, and usually it does function fairly well if it's placed in good houses in the chart or it's placed in auspicious houses in the chart. And those would be the 1st, 2nd, 5th, 9th, or 11th. And there's another rule about Jupiter being in those houses, which we're not going to talk about right now. But essentially, sometimes Jupiter being in those houses can make things, the houses of money, children, luck, 9th house, and Dharma, and gains, can introduce too many gains, I guess, is the logic behind it. So it's a significator of those houses, and it can make an individual overly optimistic about those things. And retrograde tends to inflate that trait in a chart. Saturn tends to make people a little bit down, but I've noticed during Saturn retrogrades, debts can be deferred. Oftentimes, people get breaks on debts they owe or on obligations they have, and that's usually favorable. Saturn will go direct within about a month, and a lot of things that were essentially offset or put to one side by you earlier on will essentially come due around that time. So if you made a promise or an obligation to somebody, you'll have to deliver that within a month or 2 months. Jupiter stays retrograde roughly for another couple of months as well, and around November it goes into the sign Sagittarius. And normally that's considered a good thing, but getting back to Jupiter's ability to inflate or expand things. Jupiter's a planet of expansions. Venus is a planet of increase, so they're both considered good. Basically, what happens is Jupiter will tend to expand the traits of Sagittarius. Now, is that a bad thing? Well, Sagittarius is connected with wisdom. It's the sign connected with advanced knowledge, even philosophy, even high belief systems. The problem with that is that Jupiter will be entering a sign which is connected with Saturn. It's because Saturn currently resides in Sagittarius. It'll be entering a sign connected with, and Saturn's a constricted planet. It tends to make people very rigid, very doctrinaire. Ketu's there as well. Ketu can make diseases expand. It can make illnesses expand. It can make acts of violence expand. And the third thing of it is Jupiter's entering what's called Mula Nakshatra, M-U-L-A. There are several points along the zodiac which are considered to be danger points. The last degrees of Pisces, which is Revati Nakshatra, is considered a danger point. The last degrees of Ashlesha is considered a danger point. The first 2 nakshatras in Scorpio are considered danger points, and you'll notice these are all connected with water signs, so they're dissolution points. But there's one further danger point in a Vedic chart, and that is Mula Nakshatra, because essentially what Mula does is it's associated with the goddess Kali or Nriti, who's essentially a goddess of destruction. And Jupiter enters that, and it gives impetus for change. Most change is not easy. So you'll see political change, you'll see a lot of disruption on the political stage, you'll see a lot of disruption, a lot of changes that have been pent up for quite a while happening. You'll also see Jupiter's going to be entering the United States' first house. So you may see a change. I don't think you'll see a change in administration. I've said this for a long time, and a lot of astrologers, I'm not blaming my fellow astrologers, but the United States is in a Rahu Mahadasha, so it's in the Mahadasha, which is essentially obstructing the moon right now. That usually indicates a change in direction for the country, because we were born during a Rahu Mahadasha. The last Rahu Mahadasha we were in was around the time of Teddy Roosevelt's administration, and this is the third Rahu Mahadasha sequence we're in right now. Rahu Mahadashas tend to be rather disruptive. They tend to be rather greedy. They tend to be rather self-absorbed. So a lot of the more humanitarian aspects that we look for the United States to pursue probably won't be manifesting over the next few years. And Jupiter entering Sagittarius can give it can give religious excuses for bad behavior. And Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions can give economic downturns, although that's not etched in stone, but I have seen it happen again. So it's a caution over the last few months of 2019 into around January of 2020. I would expect to see some economic disruption, and I would expect to see some kind of changes in governments around the world, and particularly in Europe, England, and even in the Far East. The other, and perhaps even in Central Asian countries like Turkey or Iran, but again, these things are not etched in stone, and I'm not advocating the elimination or the deposition of any government. The other thing is when Jupiter enters these signs, people get a little bit more ideological. They get a little bit more purist. They get a little bit more obsessed with things. Now let's talk about Mercury. Mercury is really the most benign retrograde you can imagine. I think one of the reasons people tend to be very, very concerned with it is because it's the planet, like full moons, it's the planet they're most familiar with. So most people say, oh, it's Mercury retrograde, that's why we're having all this confusion. Well, we've had this confusion with communications for the past 2 months. This isn't just a Mercury retrograde. Mercury retrograde lasts for 3 weeks and it's over. So essentially, what happens when Mercury is retrograde? Mercury is in the same sign with Mars, so people are going to be lying a little bit, but that's a Mercury-Mars conjunction that has nothing to do with Mercury being retrograde. So you'll see people say, oh, I can do that, and then all of a sudden going back and say, you know what, I can't do that, I'm sorry, I overpromised, I can't really meet that obligation. And you're kind of stuck hanging. The other thing that will happen a lot is